Well, good morning again. You're going to get tired of me today. That's all right. So I'm happy that I get a chance to be here with you to share this message. We're week 3 of this series called Battleship. The whole purpose behind this series is all about strengthening our relationships, building them up to keep them from sinking. And I don't know about you, but Battleship was definitely a favorite game of mine growing up. There was definitely one thing that, it's funny that we talked about this, but it's definitely one thing that brought up a lot in my friendships was conflict when it come to Battleship. I'm not a good loser. So there's probably some pieces that have been lost over the years from just some spasms that I have that would flip the board over or something along those lines. We really love the idea of being able to talk about relationships. Because the reality of relationships is that they're hard work, right? If you've had any sort of relationship, ones that have been successful, they take work to make them successful. They need maintenance, they need care, and if they're unattended, well, they tend to lose strength. And today, in my opinion, I get the opportunity to share what I believe is the most important piece to maintaining a relationship, and probably one of the most difficult ones. And it's communication. You guys are awfully quiet. Communication is a big deal. It's one of the hardest things that we do when we have a relationship. See, let's start here. Our goal today, here's our goal today. Our goal today is to gain understanding as to how we live out a verse that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus. Here's the verse. You can find this in the book of Ephesians. It's in chapter 4, verse 29. It says this: "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." Whew. Just think about your conversations, maybe even today. The key phrases that we see there is helpful for building others up. That's benefiting those who listen. See, here's the deal when it comes to communication. I believe that a very common misunderstanding and approach that we take in communication is really an exercise in selfishness. That when we communicate, many times, I would say that we communicate to fulfill our needs. We communicate to the building up of ourselves. Many ways, that's what we do. If you're just thinking about your conversations today, this morning, think about the things that you communicated today. What were they revolved around? Were they revolved around the benefit of others? Were they revolved around building others up? Or were they revolved around you and your needs? See, communication is necessary in all walks of life. We need to be able to communicate so that we can express our needs. That is a necessary piece of it. But when it becomes our sole purpose for communicating, that's a problem. See, communication is complicated. And if we don't think so, if you don't think communicating is complicated, then there's probably a really good chance that there is, in the wake of you, there is a lot of bad feelings and hurt people. If you don't think that communication is difficult or that it takes work. If your thought is that this is just who I am and this is just how I talk, there's probably a good chance there's probably some broken hearts that are behind you. That's the reality of it. When we're unaware of that, that's what we leave. Why is this? Why is communication difficult? Well, here's why communication is difficult. Because we communicate differently. We all communicate differently. We hear differently. And because we are made differently. And we grow up in different cultures and different environments, and all of these things shape the way that we communicate with one another or how we need communication to us. So let me just share a story about what I mean. There was a rather old-fashioned lady who was planning a couple of weeks vacation in Florida. She was also a quiet and delicate and elegant with her language. She wrote a letter to a particular campground and asked for reservations. She wrote that letter, and she wanted to make sure the campground was fully equipped with all that she was going to need, but didn't quite know how to ask about the toilet facilities. She just didn't know how to ask about that. And so after much deliberation, she didn't feel comfortable about using the word toilet in her letter. So after she thought about it, she decided that she came up with this. She would use an old-fashioned term, the bathroom commode. Some of you may know what that is. But she was still very uncomfortable with even writing that down. So instead, she just wrote BC in there. So she writes BC in there, and she rewrites the entire letter, referred to the bathroom commode as the BC, and it sounded something like this. Does the campground have its own BC? Is actually what she wrote. Well, the campground owner received the letter, and the campground owner was not an old-fashioned person by any means. Received the letter and was really confused. He couldn't figure out what the lady was talking about, especially the BC portion of this letter. It really stumped him. And after worrying about it for several days, he showed the letter to other campers, but they couldn't figure it out as well. The campground owner finally concluded that the lady was and must be asking about the location of the local Baptist church. So he sat down and wrote her a letter back. Dear Madam, I regret very much the delay in answering your letter, but I now take pleasure in informing you in that the BC is located 9 miles north of the camp and is capable of seating 250 people. I admit that it's quite a distance away, and if you're in the habit of going regularly, no doubt you will be pleased to know that a great number of people take their lunches along and make a day of it. They usually arrive early and stay late. The last time my wife and I went was 6 years ago. And it was so crowded that we had to stand up the whole time we were there. It may interest you to know that right now there is a supper plan to raise money to buy more seats. They plan to hold the supper in the middle of the BC, so everyone can watch and talk about this great event. I would like to say it pains me very much not be able to go more regularly, but it's surely not for a lack of desire on my part. As you know, as we grow older, it seems more and more of an effort, particularly in the cold weather. If you decide to come down to the campground, perhaps I could go with you the first time you go, sit with you, and just introduce you to the other folks. This is really friendly community. And it's a silly way to present this, but we communicate differently. There's a lot of things in our lives that shape us and what we find as appropriate communication and inappropriate communication. This causes difficulty within the way that we communicate with one another. And why? So what is this? The reality is that we all communicate. We all communicate in something that's called our temperament. We communicate through things that what naturally comes to us. Things about us, things that are important to us, that we're really not sure where they came from. And the tricky part about all of this, the really tricky part about all of this, is that the communication is a two-way street. We speak and we hear. And we do all that through the lens of who we are, how we've been created. We hear through our needs, our innate needs, things that have been created in us to matter to us. And many times we can't really explain why they matter to us. For instance, when I say something like safety, for some of you that means something to you. For some of you, you're like, ooh, what's that? What are we going to talk about? Or even silence. Something about those words. For some of you, there is something that is sparked inside of you when you hear those words. Something has caused your ears to perk up more, and you probably can't explain what it is about that, but there's some reason the idea of safety means something to you. But maybe when I say the word acceptance, or maybe even approval, well, those words, they spark up a whole nother set of ears. There's a whole nother set of ears that go, ooh, yeah, I like those words. Some of you right now, maybe you're even thinking, this is stupid what you're even saying, because those don't mean anything to me. In fact, maybe some of you are actually sitting there and go, well, what's wrong with me that those don't mean anything to me? Well, that's maybe because words like harmony or respect mean something to you. Or maybe for others, it's appreciation or loyalty that ring loudly in your ears. There are things, there are needs that we have that we can't explain, that when people communicate to us, this is the filter that we listen through. And if they doesn't meet that, it frustrates us. It leaves us lacking. It causes us to be confused as to why somebody would be that way. Here's what I mean by this. Have you ever had a relational issue in your life where it felt like what you said was not what was heard? Has there ever been a communication or a conflict in your life that started with that you said something but it was not actually what was heard by somebody? Have you ever thought or said or heard phrases like, I didn't mean to hurt their feelings, it just came out that way? Or maybe I wasn't yelling, I was just speaking directly. Or maybe even this, that's not what I said, that is just what you heard. Is it safe to say that many of us have probably experienced this before in our lives? I would say so. I know it has for me. There's been plenty of times where I've been on both sides of that. And it can be confusing as to why that would even be the case. Well, the reason that that's the case is that we've been all made differently. And that's not a bad thing. So it's important as we begin to consider how we communicate with one another. What Paul spoke to the Ephesians in Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. That the idea that when we communicate, it's the idea of thinking about others, considering others, thinking about how they may hear what we have to say. You know, the reality is that when it comes to communication, there's things that we need to know. Like this, when communication breaks down, imagination takes over. Right? When somebody says something that maybe you don't quite understand or makes you feel uncomfortable, what ends up taking place is our imagination begins to we begin to assume the worst, don't we? We begin to think, oh, well, they're just mean. They're just a bully, or they just don't care. They're just aloof and are way away from this. They have no desire to listen to me. But this isn't the case. It's important for us to recognize that when our communication breaks down, it leaves other people in a state of, I guess I'm just going to have to trust, or I'm going to have to assume. And we know what assuming does, don't we? It does. So to communicate better with people that we have in our lives, we must have a better understanding of what they need in terms of communication. I share this from my own experience. This has been life-altering for me. To begin to understand this, to understand that just because I speak in a certain way doesn't mean that somebody hears me in the same way. And just because somebody speaks in a certain way doesn't mean that they don't like me, or they're not my friend, or they're mean, or they're aloof. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that this is who they've been created to be. And it's not a bad thing. This has been life-altering for my marriage. The understanding of this, the recognizing of this. Here's the thing that you need to know. My wife, Tiffany, and I, we are completely different people in many, many different ways. And there's a number of reasons why we're different people. It's how we have been created. It's the environments that we've grown up in. It's the experiences in our lives. And one of the most dramatic differences is how we communicate. We communicate very, very differently. Very differently. In fact, there's been times in our life where the light bulb has just gone off. And I'll share one of those things. We did this. We started doing this study called I Said This and You Heard That. Friends, life-altering for us. life-altering for us because we began to understand a little bit more about ourselves. It's been a game changer. What we realized, and we kind of knew this but didn't know how to really understand this, is that my wife, Tiffany, she's an external processor. Myself, I'm an internal processor. What does that mean? External processor. They like to talk through their thoughts. Right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. Internal processors, we like to think about our thoughts. And we like to think long and hard about our thoughts. And when you put those combination of people together, it is really tricky. It is really, really, really tricky. It was amazing because when we realized that this is, and it didn't make either one of us bad. Because what we began to learn about this, when we began to learn about how we talk and how we think through things and how we process through things, it began to help us understand one another. I began to understand that my wife, she has to talk through it. To sit and think about it, it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to continue to spin around and knock around. That she has to work through it. She has to sit across from somebody and talk through this. But what she began to realize about me is that the glazed look in my eyes as she's talking through her thoughts was not because I didn't care. It's because it was a lot to take in. Because I needed to process something that she said, step away and come back. And we've been able to establish rules in our communication with one another that has changed our relationship dramatically. Because we began to understand one another. She began to understand that that I just don't care. But I do care. I just can't talk about it at the moment. And that she just didn't want to, I began to understand that she didn't want to just bowl over and this is all the things. I began to understand that just because she says something doesn't mean it's something that we should do. Learned that the hard way. And the reality is that as we talked through that, as we worked through that, some of that also had to do with the needs that we have, these innate needs that we have. I began to understand that for my wife, that it was important for her that she needed, as I communicated to her, things that she needed to hear was that I accepted her, that I approved her, that she has my attention and my affection. For me, it was an understanding for her to understand that I need harmony. I need a lack of stress. That there's respect that's needed in the communication to me, and that I needed to have a feeling of worth as I'm being communicated to. Otherwise, it was going to shut me down. It was going to take me to places that I didn't want to go. And it's incredible what we've learned through this. It's grown us. It's strengthened us. And it's not just us. It's every single one of you. Because maybe today you have a relationship that you have with somebody that you're beginning to go, man, there's some things that they just don't seem to hear from me. When this happens, it seems to be something that we begin to clash a little bit. And the incredible part about it doesn't make it bad. It doesn't make any one of us bad. It just makes us different. And that matters. Something else for us to recognize when it comes to communication is that our words matter. Your words matter. The things that you say matter. They are incredibly important. Our words carry the power of life and death. We have the opportunity to partner with heaven or with hell when we communicate with people. The things that we say will either build up or break somebody down. This is an absolute reality that we have in our lives. Proverbs 18:21 tells us the tongue has a power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. There's this great quote that I found as I was preparing for this from William George Jordan, who's an author. Wrote this a long, long time ago. He said this. He said, the second most deadly instrument of destruction is a loaded gun. The first is the human tongue. The gun merely kills bodies. The tongue kills reputations and oftentimes ruins characters. Each gun works alone. Each loaded tongue has hundreds of accomplices. The havoc of the gun is visible at once. The full evil of the tongue lives through all the years beyond what a man might see in his lifetime. The truth of that is profound. It is so true. The things that we say, how we say them to people, the things that we say about people, that lasts longer than what we can even fathom or imagine. Because listen, there's probably people in here today that you probably have some things that have been said about you or to you a long time ago that you're still holding on to. There's power in the way that we say things, how we say things, the words that we use. And not only does it matter what we say, it matters how we say it. How we say it matters. So this idea that this is just how I speak, this is just how I talk, is completely irrelevant and it is completely an invalid response when we look at Ephesians 4:29. When we look at that, when we look at the way that the words that we say, how we communicate with people, what we have to say to people about people, should only be what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Think about how we've communicated with one another. Think about the destruction or the building up that it has caused. It's not only the words that we speak, but how we speak them that matter. Because believe it or not, tone matters. When you say something, the tone that you say it in, it matters greatly. Our timing matters. When we choose to say something, that matters greatly. The environment matters. Where we choose to say it, that matters greatly. When we choose to say something to our child that's not necessarily building them up, and we do that in front of people, that's going to hurt. That's going to stick. There's things that we must consider about how we say what we say when we communicate with one another. So those are important things to know when it comes to communication. How? But how do we communicate better? How do we become greater communicators in our relationships so that we can build our relationships up? I would say the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand ourselves. You need to understand yourself first. You need to understand why you communicate the way that you communicate, why you say the things that you do, what makes you. What have you been made up to do? What purpose has been placed within you? Begin to understand those things about yourself is the first thing that you can do. This is big. We can understand our tendencies and how we communicate and how they may come across is huge. And we knowing the why behind how we respond. It was a big deal for my wife to understand for me that when I began to become overwhelmed and I shut down and I just got quiet, it had nothing to do with what she said or how she said it. It's who I was. It helped me to understand, helped me to go, but the thing is, I couldn't use it as an excuse. I can't use that as an excuse. I know that about myself, that I must understand that, and I need to step in. So one of the rules that we've applied to our conversations, especially when it's maybe a strong conversation, if you will, is that when she notices or when I notice that I'm beginning to get a little overwhelmed in the conversation, that I'm maybe not hearing, maybe my ears ringing is probably a good indicator that it might be time to shut things down for a little bit. When that began to happen, that we would table the conversation and that we would be okay with it. And then, now we didn't just table it, then walk away and then never have the conversation again, which I tended to do. But we had to come back to it. There had to be we had to come together in the middle of that. I couldn't use my temperament as an excuse to be shut down and to not communicate. I needed to be able to step into it. Lamentations 3:40 tells us this: let us examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord. So I would say for us, it's important to look at ourselves, understand ourselves. Let's test our tendencies to what God has to say and see how they roll out and see how we can actually walk in this. And I want to make sure that this is understood before we continue on any further. Every single one of us, every single person that you have a relationship, yourself, everyone around us, has been made on purpose for a purpose. The way they have been created, the tendencies that they have, the personalities they have, we have been created on purpose for a purpose. God has a design within us that utilizes those things for a greater purpose. There is no mistake in the creation of you. No mistake whatsoever. Now, there are dark sides to each and every one of us. There's dark sides to our personalities. There's dark sides to our temperaments. There's dark sides to us that if we're not healthy, if we're not focused on Jesus, those things are going to come out, and it will not be a healthy thing. And many times, that's when we have the relational issues that we have spawn from those things. Because we don't recognize it. We don't see it. It's important that we would seek out to understand who we are and who we've been created to be, and find a way to love who God has created you to be. Do you ever struggle with who you are? Do you ever struggle with how you handle things? Is there ever a point in your life where you stop and you look in the mirror and go, I should be better? I'm not worth anything? I want you to understand that God created you with the things that you have for a very specific purpose. That you were beautifully and wonderfully created. And so are the people around you. So I'd encourage you, find out who you are. Learn more about yourself. Because when you learn that, you learn how to operate in a healthier way. And the beauty of taking these steps and beginning to search for who you are is it should lead you to the next step, which is this: understand others. Understand others. Probably the greatest realization that you can have in a relationship with others is that they are probably not like you. They're probably not like you, and that is a good thing. It's a good thing. Because I can tell you this. I can tell you this with certainty, with absolute certainty. If there was a world of Nates, we would probably have some issues. I'm being serious. Because I know myself well enough. There would be a whole lot of things that we just wouldn't be a whole lot of getting done stuff. That's just the reality. There would be a whole lot of what ifs and should we's, because that's a part of my makeup. But maybe not a whole lot of action. We need to understand one another because we have been created to support one another and to complete the body of Christ. Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we are all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jew or Gentile, slave or free. And we are all given one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now, if the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not be for that reason stop being a part of the body. And if an ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being a part of the body. Because if the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them just as he wanted them to be. And if they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. The head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while the presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second prophets, teachers, than miracles, than the gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, and of different kinds of tongues? Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have the gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Now eagerly desire the greater gifts, and yet I will show you the most excellent way. God has created you differently. Has created the people around you differently, on purpose, for a purpose. And how we communicate with one another matters. How we encourage one another matters. Because if we look at Ephesians 4:29, what it tells us is this: do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. It is important that we recognize that we are meant to work together to complete the wholeness of Christ. The people that sit next to you, the people who bother you, they were created on purpose, for a purpose, and we need one another. It's our job to understand that. It's our job to understand that we are different and that it's okay. In fact, it's really good that we're different. So the last thing that we can do when it comes to communication, when we're considering how we communicate with one another, like we understand that we begin to understand ourselves, we begin to understand others, and then we build people up. We would use our opportunities to communicate to build people up, to encourage, to strengthen, that it would be a benefit to those who listen. Does that mean that we don't have hard conversations? No. In fact, that's important because that helps build people up. It helps encourage. It helps strengthen. The important thing to understand, all of this, everything that we do, the whole purpose that we're here is to build one another up. To recognize that there is more to this life than the mundane day-to-day, that there is more to this life than pursuing success, that there is more to this life than pursuing pleasure, that there is more to this life than what you get in your life, that there is so much more to this. In fact, this is what Jesus came to do. In John 10:10, it says, the thief came only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come so they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus didn't come to this earth and give his life just to save you so that you can just survive. He came to this earth, gave his life, bled the blood that he bled, took his last breath so that we could thrive in this life, that we could have a full and abundant life. That's what he came here for. And that has nothing to do with your circumstances in life. But that is despite your circumstances in life, that you can have a full and abundant life. And he has commissioned each and every one of us. When we say yes to him, he has commissioned us to build others up. We have been created to help others to know the one who created them and is here to give them life to the full. I'm telling you, if we want to communicate with one another well, we want to build one another up, we need to understand how each other operates. And just because you operate differently than me, it doesn't make you bad. And it doesn't make me good. It makes us different. And that's exactly how God likes it. That's exactly how he created us to be. And that's a beautiful thing when people decide to come together and realize that.